We're once again in an era of time where the destruction of knowledge, whether physically or through ideological means, is at the front of a lot of people's minds. The attacks on our libraries and archives, or the deliberate and slow defunding of them, brings to mind for a lot of us the horrific book burnings of the Holocaust, or similar events that happened during the Cold War, etc. But every institutional attack or book burning has a common historical ancestor that lies at the deepest core of a lot of our fears when we see these things happen. When you hear the word Alexandria, what do you picture? Is it an ancient city in Egypt? Odds are, probably not. It's more likely that you, like most people, imagine a vast, obscenely valuable library burning to the ground with all of the knowledge of the ancient world inside, setting us back apparently up to 1,000 years. For centuries, there's been the great legend of the Library of Alexandria, which housed the knowledge of the ancient world, and its tragic destruction in flames at the hands of... well, no one can quite agree on that part. Actually, people for generations have been unable to agree on much at all about the Great Library because the truth is, this story is a myth. A collection of myths, actually. It's a tale that's been built up over time, added to and taken from by scholar after scholar after scholar to suit one narrative or another. All we know for certain from any actual historical ancient account is this. There was a huge library in Alexandria. Actually, there were two, the Museon and the Serapeum. But beyond that, it's a wild and convoluted mystery. We don't know what the library looked like, how much information it actually stored, where exactly it was, or if it was even destroyed at all. This is made even more difficult due to the lack of existing archaeological evidence or actual contemporary sources that don't disagree with one another. The Library of Alexandria has morphed into a central symbol that we reference when discussing the destruction of knowledge, a fear that for a brief moment in the 80s and 90s was believed would be cured by the advent of the internet, a place that was touted as the new Library of Alexandria, but has instead become a double-edged sword. So what really is the truth? Why do we think there was a universal library in Alexandria? Why was it allegedly destroyed, and by whom? And what does this myth mean about our own recent history? Come learn with me. But first, let's hear a quick word from today's sponsor, June's Journey. If you're a lover of history and vintage-style murder mysteries, as well as any game that lets you decorate things, then June's Journey will be right up your alley, just like it was for me when I started playing it a couple years ago. It's a murder mystery hidden object game where you play as June, who is investigating the suspicious circumstances surrounding the deaths of her sister and brother-in-law. The hidden object scenes are really reminiscent of like those old I Spy games, with how unique and creative each one is, with such well-crafted environments and delicately researched 1920s flair. As you follow the story, you find new clues, unlock prizes, and you can use the coins that you find to buy things to decorate your island. You can see here that I've really been trying to build out my island, and I think it's looking pretty good. The story gets more and more complex over time, introducing some really fun 1920s themes such as bootlegging, as well as new and unique locations and miscellaneous other characters. And you can visit other people's islands or participate in unique special challenges. I found it extremely helpful as a way to de-stress while also still keeping my brain active, and a game this artistic with such an interesting plot has been fantastic. Download June's Journey for free by clicking the link below in the description. June's Journey is available on Android as well as iOS mobile devices and on PC through Facebook Games. Thank you so much to June's Journey for sponsoring this video, and now let's get back to learning about the Library of Alexandria. To set the stage for our great legend, we need some background context. Around the year 300 BC, Alexander the Great's reign has passed and he is succeeded by Ptolemy I and Ptolemy II. Alexander the Great had in his own lifetime successfully invaded and taken over Egypt, becoming its pharaoh, and thus Egypt's new capital became Alexandria around 331 BC, near what is now Abu Qir Bay. It was an extremely convenient location at the Rosetta mouth of the Nile River, a vital shipping lane. The city, from the surviving descriptions we have of it, was beautiful and grandiose, with marble buildings and wide streets laid out in a grid. It was often said that Alexander actually took part in planning the city himself, which would make sense given how it was named after him, so he must have wanted it to reflect his wishes. Alexander died in 323 BC, and his body was returned to Alexandria, where his tomb, which is now lost, became a popular tourist destination, even visited by Julius Caesar. Put a dagger in that, we'll get back to him later. Alexandria's other popular tourist destination was its really cool lighthouse. Anyway, the Ptolemies were really gunning for Alexandria to replace Naucratis as the Hellenistic center of Egypt, so between that and its perfect spot as a trade center, Alexandria exploded in size and power and quickly became, allegedly, the largest city in the world. And because of their goal to become a Hellenistic center, that obviously necessitated religious learning centers. And so, the Museion and the Serapeum were constructed. The Museion, being the main one, was home to a number of great scholars including Euclid, Hipparchus, and Eratosthenes. Well, because of all this, for 3 centuries, Egypt had Greek pharaohs, hence why all of these sources from and about the library were written in Greek. For centuries, Persian and Armenian stories have said that when Alexander saw the magnificent library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, he was then inspired to collect the knowledge of the lands he had conquered in a Greek-translated archive. Of course, true or not, this inspiration would trickle down to Ptolemy I's reign. But as powerful and beloved as the Museion became, it wasn't without its detractors. Timon of Phlius, for example, once referred to the scholars of the Museion as people scribbling endlessly and waging a constant war of words with each other in the muse's birdcage. And a birdcage might just be the best description of it. A gilded cage, yes, but still a cage. The Museion scholars, part of the Royal Academy system, were rarely allowed to leave the palace district, and some, like Aristophanes, were even imprisoned if they tried to join a different royal court. This high-security, high-tension situation seems to have been reserved for the much more powerful Museion, however, and the Serapeum was more of the chill public library branch. So the myth itself is fairly straightforward, but there's a point where it forks off into 2 different directions. The general legend goes that the city of Alexandria had this magnificent universal library that housed the knowledge of the ancient world, hundreds of thousands of invaluable texts that were nowhere else, and that scholars would travel from all over, risking life and limb to study. The Library of Alexandria serves as the symbolic blueprint for a ton of fictional universal libraries. The buried library from Avatar: The Last Airbender is a pretty good example of one. But then, along comes either Julius Caesar or Caliph Omar, depending on which popular story you believe, and in a horrible, bloody invasion, the library is burned to the ground. And so, hundreds of thousands of priceless books are lost. Pretty straightforward, right? Wrong. Nothing about the ancient world is straightforward. If you'd asked me like a couple years ago what historical event pisses me off the most, I would have said the burning of the Library of Alexandria. I fell for the story because it's that pervasive and popular, and everyone says that that's what happened. But as with most things in history, I've discovered it's not as simple as we think. And in fact, a lot of it simply isn't true at all. As expected, trying to sort fact from fiction in this puzzle only makes things more and more complicated, especially because many accounts of the library weren't written until hundreds of years after it was supposedly destroyed. Now, of course, obviously, historians writing about historical events that happened decades or hundreds of years ago is not the discrediting issue here. It's when they're failing to reference any first-hand contemporary sources or back their version of events up with anything, it's like, why are we first hearing about this version of events in the Middle Ages? And why from you? Where are you getting this info from? But we do have at least a few accounts that may have been written about it during its lifetime, such as this one written about 30 to 25 BC by a historian and geographer named Strabo. The museum is part of the palaces. It has a public walk and a palace furnished with seats in a large hall in which the men of learning who belong to the museum take their common meal. This community possesses also property in common, and a priest formerly appointed by the kings, but at present by Caesar, presides over the museum. This begs the question, in the absence of mention of any books or scrolls, was it a museum or a library? Well, it was quite literally called the Museion in Greek, or Museum in Latin, which meant that essentially it was a shrine honoring the Muses, the goddesses presiding over poetry and music. This would explain why the museum was run by a priest. So this museum wouldn't have exactly been what we think of as a museum today, a place that houses ancient treasures for display and education. The museum was more likely a place of study and scholarly meditation where the great thinkers of the area would live and work together. It makes sense then that, of course, the museum would house valuable texts. Many scholars agree that the museum would have been built after the reign of Alexander the Great, sometime around about 300 BC. So by the time that Strabo's account pops up, the museum has already existed for a few centuries. About a century or so later, we finally get some word about the museum's contents, written by a Jewish writer in the Letter to Aristeas, writing, Demetrius of Phalerum, the president of the king's library, received vast sums of money for the purpose of collecting together, as far as he possibly could, all of the books in the world. By means of purchase and transcription, he carried out, to the best of his ability, the purpose of the king. On one occasion I was present, he was asked, "How many thousands of books are there in the library?" And he replied, "More than 200,000, O king, and I shall make an endeavor in the immediate future to gather together the remainder also, so that the total of 500,000 may be reached." Demetrius of Phalerum was an honored disciple of Aristotle, so he was a pretty important guy. Another really important guy around during this time was Galen of Pergamon, a Greek medical writer. In his commentary on Hippocrates' Epidemics, he wrote extensively about the Ptolemies' obsession with book collecting and the manner with which they went about getting said books. And I know this is kind of a really long quote, but it's a very, very important one. Arguably maybe one of the most important that we have in this entire video, so bear with me. He writes, Ptolemy the king of Egypt was so eager to collect books that he ordered the books of everyone who sailed there to be brought to him. The books were then copied into new manuscripts. He gave the new copy to the owners whose books had been brought to him after they sailed there. But he put the original copy in the library with the inscription, "A book from the ships." They say that a copy of the third book of the Epidemics has been found with the inscription, "A book from the ships as amended by Nemon of Sideh." Some claim that the inscription does not say "as amended," but simply gives the name of Nemon, because when books were taken from all the others who sailed there, 607 of the servants of the king wrote down their names in the copies that were deposited in the storehouses. This Ptolemy is said to have given sufficient proof of his eagerness to collect old books by his behavior towards the Athenians. After giving them 15 talents of silver as a surety, he received from them the manuscripts of Sophocles and Euripides and Aeschylus, on the understanding that he would simply make new copies from the manuscripts and then promptly return them intact. But after he had produced magnificent new copies on the finest writing material, he kept the books that the Athenians had sent to him and sent back to them the copies that he had made. He urged them to keep the 15 talents and at the same time to receive new copies instead of the old books that they had sent to him. The Athenians would have no other option, even if he had kept the old books without sending new copies to them, because when they accepted the money, they had agreed that if he kept the books, then they would keep the money. And so they accepted the new copies and kept the money. This quote is vital because it proves wrong a pretty central part of the myth of the Library of Alexandria, the belief that all of that ancient knowledge was lost. In reality, the library had a pretty dedicated system of making copies of pretty much every book that they acquired. Even if they kept the original, they typically made sure to send a copy back, and not just any copy either, but a very well made and high quality copy. Not only that, but a lot of books weren't even kept on site at the library at all, but often in storehouses off-site, at least temporarily. So even if it was true that the library was burned down in one fell swoop, it would not have caused the loss of all of that knowledge, at all. Part of the root of this part of the myth comes from that other quote from the Jewish writer talking about the Ptolemies' obsession with owning all of the books in the world. But, let's just do a little bit of history grass touching here for a minute. What part of guy wants to own all the books in the world means he actually succeeded? Because even if he didn't make all of those copies, he didn't get all of the books in the world. We have absolutely no idea how many books he actually succeeded in collecting, and that doesn't even address how limited of a worldview this is too. What about all the books and scrolls and tablets in the hands of Central and Southern African and East Asian scholars? What about the valuable oral histories of the people of the Americas? To believe that the loss of one library, a large one, yes, but just one, would eradicate a world's worth of knowledge even just in Europe and the MENA region, is laughable. Colin Higgins writes, "It is naive to imagine a library to have been a physical embodiment of the sum of ancient learning. To do so betrays a teleological misreading of history and a reduction of cultural complexity. Imagining a single perfect moment of intellectual knowledge is to misimagine libraries and to risk overreach. Alexandria was no apogee of Greek culture and civilization, merely part of its history." Ancient writers all gave drastically varying accounts of just how many texts the library actually had, and hardly if any at all say what year that their number is coming from. It ranged anywhere between 40,000 to 700,000. So Ptolemy either embarrassingly fell short of his 500k books goal or impressively outdid it. We have no idea. Of course, although we know a great deal of the books in the library's collection were either copies or had copies made, it's also true that many books in the collection were also the result of Ptolemaic plunder or were purchased outright. As for the burning itself, let's go over each claim. The first being that Julius Caesar burnt the library when he invaded Alexandria in 48 BC. See, I told you we'd get back to that guy. One text from the time states, "He burnt all those ships and the rest that were in the dock because he could not protect so wide an extent with his small force, and at once he embarked his men and landed them on Pharos." This is the only mention from the time that mentions Caesar burning anything in Alexandria, and it was just the ships in the docks, which were made of wood and tied together. Of course, it is possible that high winds may have spread that fire to the shoreline buildings, but we have no actual accounts of the time of that. No text from the time mentioned the library catching on fire during the invasion either. Julius Caesar wasn't actually blamed for the loss of the library until about a century after his invasion, when the 9th book of the Dialogues of Lucius Annaeus Seneca made a pretty bold claim. 40,000 books were burned at Alexandria. Some would have praised this library as a most noble memorial of royal wealth, like Titus Livius, who says that it was a splendid result of the taste and attentive care of the kings. It had nothing to do with taste or care, but was a piece of learned luxury. And later, Plutarch put a certain scoundrel's name to this emerging historical crime. In this war, to begin with, Caesar encountered the peril of being shut off from water, since the canals were dammed up by the enemy. In the second place, when the enemy tried to cut off his fleet, he was forced to repel the danger by using fire, and this spread from the dockyards and destroyed the great library. The blame on Caesar tumbled from there, continuing to grow more and more and more extreme in severity as each author individually put their own dramatic spin on the story. Paulus Orosius wrote, "The flames spread to part of the city, and there burned 400,000 books stored in a building which happened to be nearby. So perished that marvelous monument of the literary activity of our ancestors, who had gathered together so many great works of brilliant geniuses." And then, finally, our highest number at last appears in Ammianus Marcellinus's Rerum Gestarum. In this were invaluable libraries, and the unanimous testimony of ancient records declares that 700,000 books brought together by the unremitting energy of the Ptolemaic kings were burned in the Alexandrine War when the city was sacked under the dictator Caesar. Whew. Over time, this obsession with Caesar as the cause of this supposedly immense loss of ancient knowledge grew in popularity during the Middle Ages. Sometime around the 490s, the Latin poet Lucanus wrote Bellum Civile, a poem about Caesar's invasion of Alexandria. "Nor slow the fire to seize the hempen cables on the decks, oozing with melting pitch the oarsman's bench, all in one moment in the topmost yards, burst into flames, half merged the vessels lay, while swam the foemen, all in arms the wave, nor fell the blaze upon the ships alone, but seized with writhing tongues the neighboring homes. And fanned to fury by the southern breeze, tempestuous it leaped from roof to roof. Not otherwise than on its heavenly track, unfed by matter, glides the ball of light, by air alone aflame." No mention of the library here, but the poem provides a great example of the budding interest in this era directly following the library's final disappearance, in romanticizing the great destruction of Alexandria and later its great library. Here's the problem though. These accounts of the library having been destroyed in one great incident conflict with other facts that we know about the ancient world. For instance, if the library was burned down, then how could Emperor Hadrian have visited it in 130 AD, according to Historia Augusta? And how then could Emperor Claudius have added to the old museum at Alexandria, a full century after Caesar's invasion? Domitian? How could Emperor Domitian have used the labor of scholars at the Alexandrina Bibliotece to copy lost books? Written record of the Museon's current existence persisted as late as the year 380 AD, when Theon wrote about a man from the Museon at Alexandria. Sure, even if the library itself still existed, it's entirely possible that its collection of books may have been lost or partially lost at some point. After all, Alexandria was the victim of many Roman attacks over the years. Emperors Aurelian, Caracalla, and Diocletian all massacred, burned, and ransacked the city. Alexandria was also a victim of natural disasters, such as the earthquake that destroyed the really cool lighthouse. So, yeah, it wouldn't exactly be shocking if the library got its ass kicked at some point, maybe even multiple points. Notice how this whole time I've been talking about a library, even though in the intro to this video I mentioned there being 2 libraries. Yeah, let's address that. Actually, there were even more than 2 libraries in the city, but 2 of them were the really cool big royal ones. Of course, the main one is the Museum that we've been talking about, but we can't forget the Museum's daughter institution, the Serapeum, which we do know carried about 42,000 books. We even know what it looked like, courtesy of Apthonius in Progon Masmata 12. Within the colonnades enclosures were built, some having become repositories for the books available to the diligent for study, thus spurring on an entire city to a mastery of learning. Others were established long ago to honor the gods. For colonnades, there is a roof adorned with gold, and the capitals of columns were worked in bronze and overlaid with gold. Nor is there only one adornment of the open court, for another is different. It has the battles of Perseus, and one of the columns rising above the others in height occupies the center position, thereby attracting attention to the place. Anyone going along does not yet know where he is proceeding unless he uses the column of Diocletian as a sign of the ways. And being visible all around, it so makes the Acropolis on land and on sea. Indeed, the beauty is beyond the power of words, and if anything has been neglected, it happened as a result of awe. Sounds pretty neat, right? Well, unfortunately, it got trashed. Around 391 AD, there was a lot of anti-pagan sentiment going around, especially coming from Emperor Theodosius I. So, as you can imagine, Hellenistic temple libraries are not exactly going to be let off the hook here, and Theophilus, the Bishop of Alexandria, got to work destroying the Serapeum and replacing it with a church. In Book 5 of Socrates Scholasticus's Church History, he writes, "The governor of Alexandria and the commander-in-chief of the troops in Egypt assisted Theophilus in demolishing the heathen temples. These were therefore razed to the ground, and the images of their gods molten into pots and other convenient utensils for the use of the Alexandrian church." We have records of Christian troops and citizens both partaking in burning and ransacking these old Hellenistic temples, and Theon, the library's last recorded director, and the father of the philosopher Hypatia, was murdered by a Christian mob in Alexandria in 415 AD. It's still unclear what exact role the museum and Serapeum play in this part of history, but given the fact that we don't hear about either of them existing after this point, it's safe to say that the 390s was likely the 2 institutions' final end, if not earlier in the 200s, when Emperor Aurelian razed the royal district of the city to the ground. This really puts a wrench in the second most popular theory about the library's destruction, that it was destroyed in the Arab invasion of 642 AD, or more specifically, that Ptolemy's collection of books from the library was destroyed by the conquering Caliph Omar. The story goes that Caliph Omar was told that the books were useless, since if they were in accordance with the Quran, then they must be useless, since surely then the Quran suffices, and if they aren't in accordance with the Quran, then there's no need to preserve them, so either way, they must be destroyed. And so the books from the library were sent to the Alexandria bathhouses to be burned as fuel to heat the waters there, according to Ibn al-Kifti and Christian polymath Gregory Bar Hebraeus. But this version of events was penned down 600 years after all of this would have gone down, because Al-Kifti and Hebraeus lived in the 11 to 1200s. The general himself who actually invaded Alexandria back then, Amru ibn al-As, never once mentioned the library, possibly because it may have already been long gone, and none of the widely known and very talkative contemporary writers of the time ever once mentioned the destruction of a great royal library, an event that no self-respecting writer at the time would have passed passed on having an opinion about. 18th century English Enlightenment historian Edward Gibbon, who wrote a very popular and famous book about the fall of Rome, was deeply critical and skeptical about this popular "the Arabs did it" theory as well. After all, he posited, why on earth would the Caliph burn Jewish and Christian texts that the library may have held if they're considered holy texts in Islam too? Gibbon instead theorizes that the demise of the Great Library was not one great event, but rather perhaps something that we can understand a bit today. That the library died slowly, quietly, over time, both from the wounds of numerous invasions and attacks that must have damaged the collection at least a bit, as well as the slow decay of social and monetary support for the library too. It was not fire that killed the Library of Alexandria in the end. Perhaps, instead, it was neglect. Colin Higgins continues, "We have been primed to believe that the Library of Alexandria ended with a bang, but what if it ended with a whimper? It's possible, and in this author's opinion likely, that the library or libraries of ancient Alexandria literally crumbled away, a victim of the humid and variable littoral climate, budget cuts, and administrative disinterest. It's worth remembering that most library destructions are actually deaths by 1,000 cuts." In the end, the idea of the Library of Alexandria is incredibly romantic to people for a number of reasons, not the least of which being that we love the idea of a universal library itself. This mystical idea of a library that contains a vast, endless wealth of knowledge for everyone to access. In recent years, with the rise of the digital age, new attempts at universal libraries have cropped up, like the Bibliotheca Universalis, for instance, which is the joint effort to combine forces between a number of libraries all over the world. And even more notably, a new library at Alexandria was built quite literally over the ashes of the old one. In Alexandria, the Bibliotheca Alexandrina is a new digitally focused universal library in Egypt that seeks to continue the mission of the original Museon and provide the world a window into Egyptian academic resources. But though these new attempts to recreate Alexandria's goal of the universal library are noble, the ideas behind them are perhaps inherently flawed. As many scholars observe, a universal library is meaningless and a perfect library is impossible, because perfection is subjective, time and social change ensures that, and a true universal library would be forever expanding and impossible to truly manage. Perfection and universality don't exist. This becomes painfully obvious if you consider the existence of what may be the one true universal library, the internet itself. But as we know intimately by now, the overabundance of information is not necessarily a blessing, it's also a curse. An unceasing torrential river of knowledge makes it impossible for us to truly learn, to effectively understand truth from lies. It's the reason we're grappling so agonizingly right now with the proliferation of online misinformation and deliberate fake news. We are, all of us, the scholars of the Museon, trapped in our own gilded bird cages of wires and code, unable now to leave and thus forever entangled in a fight with knowledge. And we're largely helpless as our cage crumbles around us. Human knowledge has its limits. Our universal library is a computer, but we aren't, and it's easy to forget that. All of us are susceptible to misinformation, which is why cross-checking what we learn is so important. And I think now, more than ever, our physical libraries are also so incredibly vital. But they too are suffering the same slow fates as these ancient libraries, like the Museon. Deliberate governmental defunding, attacks by far-right hate groups and parents who are just concerned about the children, sometimes a lack of patrons. Richard Avendon wrote for Time magazine, "Alexandria is a cautionary tale of the danger of creeping decline, through the underfunding, low prioritization, and general disregard for the institutions that preserve and share knowledge, libraries, and archives. Today, we must remember that war is not the only way that an Alexandria can be destroyed. The long history of attacks on knowledge includes not just deliberate violence, during the Holocaust or China's Cultural Revolution, for example, but also the willful deprioritization of support for these institutions, which we are witnessing in Western societies today. The impact of these various acts of destruction of libraries and archives has had on communities and on society as a whole is profound. We may not have been able to save the Library of Alexandria, nor any other great depository of knowledge that was destroyed or faded over time, but I guess even though it's gone, realizing that we didn't actually lose all that much with its disappearance is sort of comforting. Less comforting to know that while all those books weren't exactly burned in one fatal attack, most of them are lost to time or were destroyed slowly in some war or plunder, some attack, some fire, or deliberately wiped out as one religious ideology overtook another. These books weren't made to stand the test of time, after all. They were, in actuality, papyrus scrolls, which aren't exactly known for their durability, much less over the course of 2 millennia. So, we're left with kind of a mixed bag here. By debunking this myth, I'm not really leaving you with much good news. The library's still gone, the steady erosion of time has taken from us much of the ancient knowledge that it held, but to be honest, that's not unlike, well, literally any other facet of history. We've lost so much, and there's so much that we'll never know, because that's simply how history is. The Dark Ages, a term I despise, aren't known as such because it was a period of time where everyone was dumb and no progress was made. It's because so little physical information remains from that period. The absence of something for us to hold today, thousands of years later, doesn't mean that it was never there. And someday, decades or centuries in the future, odds are this conundrum may come to haunt us too, when the technology that we live our lives on becomes obsolete, when vital exchanges and forums die unarchived because no one's left around to pay the web hosting bill, when vital resources like the Wayback Machine don't work because they ran out of funding, because people didn't care enough to keep things going. The web is our universal library, and it'll peter out just the same someday. Probably. Who knows? But when that does happen, the seeming permanence that we took for granted will be lost, and our present moment may very well someday be the future's dark age. But to be honest, I don't think that is necessarily something for us regular schmucks like you or me to be panicking about. There's very material things that we can do. Hoard information offline, collect things you find interesting, if you've got interesting rare objects like books or documents, scan or take pictures of them and put them online where anyone can see or read them. Write notes on the back of your photos telling who's in the photo, the context of what it was taken in. You can protect our very important not online local libraries by going to sign up for a library card. Check out books once in a while. Heck, just go hang out there. The more you do that, the more funding they get. If there's a book that you want to read but you can't or don't want to buy it, tell your local library to buy it and then read it from them. And please, if you see nasty shit happening in your area with these concerned, bigoted parents and boards trying to shut down libraries or get diverse or progressive books taken away or punishing librarians for just doing their jobs, please speak out and try to help the library out. Those are all very impactful material things that you and I can do. And that's more valuable than mourning a myth. Thank you for learning with me about a confusing legend and a pretty neat historical library. Although we come away from the story with more questions than answers, I don't necessarily think that that's a bad thing. After all, more questions gives us more opportunities to find maybe some unrelated answers that we wouldn't have otherwise learned about. So, you see, a misleading legend is never really a complete loss. Don't forget to head to the link in the description below to try out June's Journey for free for any mobile device or on your PC. I hope you all had a safe and healthy holiday season, and until next time, wash thy hands, wear thy mask, and say thank you to your local librarians.